You've got to be really thoughtful and clear and specific about what is this particular problem and what can neuroscience do to help solve that problem in an evidence-based, science-first way. Not just using words, not just saying things, and then how can you kind of make it practical? Like how can you integrate that in? And in coaching, I say that could be anything from a metaphor to a mnemonic.
Welcome to the HAUS Hub Podcast, your go-to space where design, cognitive sciences, well-being, and business come together. I'm your host, Monica Costa, and today you're tuning into an expert conversation where we talk with brilliant minds from around the world to explore the ideas, research, and experiences shaping the future of design and human well-being. Today's conversation is one that I've been truly looking forward to because I'm joined by Dr. Sarah McKay, a PhD neuroscientist, author, and science communicator. She's the founder of the Neuroscience Academy and the author of several books, including the Woman's Brain book and Baby Brain, where she explores how the brain, particularly the female brain, changes throughout life and pregnancy. She also wrote the book Brain Health for Dummies, which offers a practical, accessible guide to caring for our brain. A must read. In this episode, we touch on a bit of everything, and I'm sure that her perspective, which is grounded in science and shaped by real-life experiences, will feel not only empowering to you, but also deeply human, because she has a beautiful way of making complex topics feel clear and genuinely relatable. This podcast is powered by HAUS, born from its mission to guide designers in creating spaces for well-being grounded in cognitive sciences principles. Let's dive in. Hi, Sarah. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to start from the very beginning. And I want to know, who is Sarah McKay from a personal level?
Oh, gosh. So who am I? Well, think about who am I right now sitting in my room. I live in Sydney, Australia. I grew up in New Zealand. I live on the northern beaches of Sydney, so I'm very fortunate to look out of my home office window out over the Pacific Ocean. So the northern beaches of Sydney is where I call home now. I'm married to a gorgeous Irish economist, and we have two teenage boys who are in their final year of high school and their third to final year of high school. So our life kind of revolves around raising our boys on the northern beaches of Sydney, and with also kind of an eye on New Zealand, where I grew up, where my mum and sister still live, and an eye on Dublin Island, where my husband's family is. And I guess I ended up on this call because way back in 1993, when I was a first-year university student doing a Psychology 101 lecture, I was introduced to the idea of neuroscience for the very first time, and was utterly captivated. Thought it was the coolest. I'd never learned about the brain or neurons or synapses or anything to do with neuroscience as a high school student in the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't really a thing that they taught. And I was so captivated. I moved universities, did a degree in neuroscience. And then that's kind of really been where my career has followed along ever since. I worked as a researcher, did a PhD, worked as a neuroscience researcher in various places. And then when I had my boys, decided I wanted to leave academia. I wasn't very good at playing the game of academia, and I really felt like I was missing out by having to be an expert on almost nothing. So I decided to leave academia behind, stayed at home for a few years raising my boys, and slowly started building a science communications business, because I think I think science should be really at the forefront more than what it is. And I wanted to specialize in talking about neuroscience. I still think today that neuroscience is as cool and as exciting as it was when I first heard about it in 1993. And I'm very fortunate because I get to spend a lot of my time enthusiastically sharing cool neuroscience ideas with other people who seem to want to listen.
Absolutely. And also sharing it and sharing the enthusiasm, which is growing lately, actually, from my point of view, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've thought it was cool since the early 90s. And, there were lots of people working in that space then. We didn't have social media. We barely had the internet then. But even more so than when I was working as an academic neuroscientist, as a researcher here in Sydney, that was kind of sort of 2002 through to about 2005, 6-ish. Mm-hmm. People were interested in neuroscience, but it wasn't popularized in the way that it has been now, thanks to neuroscience being communicated via social media and via the internet. So the problem is it's an incredibly complex subject, and often people's enthusiasm for neuroscience and wanting to talk about it or use it far outpaces their knowledge. And in any discipline, but particularly health science, medicine fields, when there's big gaps in knowledge, it can get filled with not necessarily facts, can get filled with a few myths and kind of fallacies and ideas that are not necessarily contemporary. So a lot of the work I do is to try and keep people really up to date. And the last sort of 10 years, really, I've specialised more so, one, in brain health, and two, specifically in women's brain health. I started writing and sort of sharing the research and doing science communications, particularly in the space around the female brain and women's health through a neuroscience lens, because there's some really cool and interesting things that go on in the female lifespan and in girls' and women's lives that we can look at through the lens of neuroscience. And that field in particular is going through it's like booming. So it's pretty fun space to be on the sidelines of.
And actually, I know, and this is something that we've discussed before, I know that for a long time, neuroscience research has been largely focused on men. And only in the recent years, it has been a real effort to actually have a better understanding in women's brain and mental health, and even in her hormone cycles and all this.
Mm-mm.
So, and as you mentioned, I see a lot of your work specializing in that. And actually, I think that maybe your students are mostly women, right?
Yeah, I attract a lot of girls and women who come into my courses. So yeah, I do teach. I've been teaching online, sort of I call it applied neuroscience. So neuroscience is really relevant to other people. I've been teaching that online for 10 years now, and I would say 80, perhaps even 90% of most of my cohorts are women. But that's also largely as well because of the disciplines that choose to come and learn from me. So that's like coaches, education, therapy, leadership, HR, allied health. They're traditionally female-dominated professions. So yeah, I have a lot of kind of girls and women that I work with. But then I think it's also particularly interesting to start looking through the lens of neuroscience, at our lives. And then, as you kind of hinted at it, this idea that neuroscience, science, health and medicine in particular, does have this kind of dismal history of focusing mostly on the males of a species, whether that be male humans or whether that be male lab animals, either not focusing on females or not looking at sex as a biological variable. And I know when I was doing my neuroscience research, I'd never actually wrote down and I did a lot of my research looking at early stages of brain development, and I never really looked, and I was looking at development of the visual system in particular, and I never wrote down the biological sex of the animals that I was studying because it just didn't really seem relevant. Or maybe I did, but I never analysed that data. That said, because I was looking at the visual system and literally what we see and the light that hits our retina and enters our eye isn't really, there's not really any sex difference in terms of how that's filtered. It's pretty standard everywhere. The visual system is probably, you're not going to be seeing any biological sex differences in there. But I wasn't not studying females or not studying males because I thought, well, I'm only going to study the male of the species. It was more so that it didn't really seem relevant to the work I was doing. So, there's lots of kinds of reasons why we've focused not on sex as a variable or only males have been focused on. And for a long time, there was a perception, and this is scientists just trying to reduce the kind of the variables that they have to contend with in analysing data. The concept was that whether we're looking at women, human women, or we're looking at lab animals, that menstrual cycles and cyclical hormones might add variability in that could just make the data more complicated to analyse. And so for a long time it was like, well, if we just look at the males, we've removed that variability. And then there are other kind of historical reasons. I mean, men were not asking questions about women's reproductive health and things like puberty and menstrual cycle and pregnancy and menopause. That was ignored for many years. Sometimes women weren't included in clinical trials because people were trying to do the right thing. They didn't want to enroll women of a reproductive age into a clinical trial because she might fall pregnant and then perhaps the drug that was being trialled could have some inadvertent effects on the unborn baby who hadn't consented to being part of a clinical trial. So it was like, well, it's best that we don't ever run that risk, so let's just exclude females altogether. So that was kind of well-intentioned, but the combination of all of these oversights, well-meaning exclusion, and just not really kind of thinking about questions that matter has resulted in a lack of information around a lot of aspects of women's health, in health and medicine altogether, and in neuroscience. And kind of one of the ideas is that when we think about the sort of the standard body shape and size or physiology or functioning, that's far more evidence-based for a human male than it is for a human female. That doesn't mean when I go to my GP, she walks in, she goes, oh gosh, I don't know how to treat a female. It's more so that maybe drug doses or maybe side effects or maybe a surgical procedure has been tried and tested much more so in males. So it's more evidence-based for males than females. And all of that it's a shame that has happened, but I'm unfortunately eternally optimistic. The thing is, we know that. We're not carrying on with that. Well, I mean, maybe things are kind of crazy in the US at the moment, but I mean, we now know that there are gaps, and those gaps have been measured, and we know that what data is missing, and we've now got a whole lot of people working really, really hard to fill those data gaps. We've got some amazing scientists out here who are specifically focused on sex as a biological variable, on looking specifically at women's health problems, looking specifically at women's health through the lens of neuroscience. So, I mean, the data gaps were there, and we're now working to fill that, although, the US has kind of gone a bit rogue at the moment. So who knows what's gonna happen there. So, I think it's right now is a very, very exciting time to be working in the women's brain health space, particularly around science communications. People have got a thirst and a need and a deep interest in it. There's a lot of charismatic influencers out there. What I try and do is put the science first. I don't have an agenda apart from communicating the science in a really pragmatic, clear, simple way so people can understand what is going on and what meaning can we make of that, rather than trying to be an activist and solve, with a particular goal. I'm not trying to cherry pick the data to suit my agenda. I'm trying to just share where the science currently is at and what we can do with it.
And I see that you had this book, or you're updating it, about women's brain.
Yeah, so I've been a bit prolific in the last year or two. I don't even know how, because I never thought I'd write one book, let alone I say 3.5. So I wrote the Women's Brain book. I'm holding, if people are looking at the screen. I don't really love the title, but the publishers liked the title. I wanted to call it All in Her Head, but they didn't like that. And this is looking at the female lifespan, looking at, in utero, childhood, puberty, menstrual cycle, adolescence, mental health, pregnancy, menopause, old age, looking at like the entire lifespan through the lens of neuroscience. What's happening to our brain as we go through these stages, as our brain shaped and sculpted by the experiences of female biology and living as a girl or woman in the world. And I wrote this in 2016, 2017. And so much has happened since then. I wanted to do a second edition because I started getting a bit embarrassed when I'd be at a book event and I'd give people a book and I go, but this chapter's up in this chapter and don't pay attention to this and this has changed. Now we've got more here. And I was like, I'm going to write a second edition because in the 8 years since that's got research published up until the very beginning of kind of 2016, 2017. I wanted to do an update to 2025 because there's been so much that has happened then. In the intervening time, I also wrote a whole book on pregnancy and motherhood, which I call Baby Brain, and I call it the surprising neuroscience of how pregnancy and motherhood sculpt our brains and change our minds for the better. And the for the better is really important because I was saying to you earlier, I get so frustrated because whenever men talk about health science or medicine, or particularly neuroscience, men's health is always through the lens of peak performance, longevity, biohacking. How can we become more awesome? If I sit in an ice bath, will that like make me live forever? And it's all like this macho peak performance. And then whenever it's a conversation around neuroscience and women's health, it's about dysfunction and decline and brain fog and baby brain and anxiety and depression, as if the starting point of a female brain is broken and the starting point of a male brain is already performing. We've got to make it peak performer. Yeah. And I'm so tired of that conversation because I think that we can have conversations around women's health and biology that is also talking about strengths. Women's brains go through so many changes across the course of our lives, depending, on what life experiences you have. Not everyone, of course, has pregnant and becomes a mother, but most other things we all share. And our brains are so plastic and flexible and adaptive and responsive. And we see how our brains flex and adapt and respond. And we don't talk about the upsides of that. We only ever talk about what goes wrong. And I just wanted to talk about pregnancy and motherhood through like a positive lens, a strengths lens, not just dysfunction and decline. And then at the beginning of last year, I spent the first half of last year working my guts out, and I wrote for the For Dummies series. People might have read Excel spreadsheets for dummies, or I don't know, astronomy for dummies or something. Anyway, I wrote Brain Health for Dummies, and that was to just try and put in everything I know about neuroscience and brain health and well-being and mental health and healthy aging and development into kind of one book, which I worked really hard on. And even now I'm like, I forgot about that. I keep thinking of topics I missed, but I'm not going to write a second version of that. But so there's that book as well. And then, as I said, the first book has a new edition and a new cover coming out in July. So that's my book stories.
Well, I love it. And actually, I wanted to ask you, how did writing these books actually shape the decisions that you make in your life? Because, you're a woman as well. And as I mentioned before we started even recording, I see you have all these different parts of a person going on, from sailor to ocean swimmer. And then I think you also went traveling to the very south of our world.
Yeah, I went to Antarctica a few weeks ago. Yeah. I think I'm in a really fortunate point in my life as well. I just turned 50 at the beginning of the year. So, I've been working for a long time. I've been thinking and writing and talking and discussing and having conversations around neuroscience and brain health for so many years that I guess I kind of know what works, and I have the time and the space and the resources to think about how I can kind of curate a life that's healthy and well. I also happen to live in the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia, which a year or so ago, my particular little group of suburbs here was rated as having the highest well-being in the country, and I think Australia has some of the highest well-being indexes in the world. So I also live in an incredibly fortunate part of the world where the social determinants of health are all in my favor, and I'm surrounded by people where health and well-being is just kind of part of what we do every day. From the moment we wake up, we're on the beach watching the sunrise in the ocean. It's a very sporty, wealthy, healthy, well environment I live in. So I must say that a large part of me having the choices available to me is the environment that I live in, as much as anything. But also because of the neuroscience, I've been, marinating in this my entire career for over 30 years now. I kind of know what you need. And I know that the foundation of all good health is sleep. And I love sleep, and I'm very good at sleep. I'm probably the only 50-year-old woman on the planet who sleeps better than their husband. I usually fall asleep at around 9:30, and I wake up just before 6, and I don't even wake up in the middle of the night. I sleep really, really, really well. And I focus, a lot of my life is built around making sure I get that sleep. I know how important exercise and movement is, and I try and do that in as many fun ways as possible. Like I lift weights, I go to the gym 3 times a week and do weights, but I walk my dog and I swim in the ocean, and I'm in a musical theatre group which is hilarious and made up just of the mums and dads in my suburb that were associated with the primary school. I can't sing or dance, but the social connectedness that comes from that. So I try and move my body in ways that are fun. I don't only run or only go to CrossFit, and I'm not evangelical about that. Do what you want. I do what I do. I try and eat a really healthy diet because I know that's important, but I also love a glass of wine, and I love a gin and tonic, and I love a laugh with my friends over a few drinks. I'm not adverse to that at all, so I'm not pious about those kinds of life choices. And I just try and take as many opportunities as I can to have fun. This year in particular, I'm incredibly fortunate because I decided I was going to have a sabbatical of sorts, or a gap year from writing, from sitting at my desk doing work. Well, I have to kind of work one day a week to get the business over, but the rest of the time I'm doing watercolor classes. I've always did a lot of art when I was young, and I'm now kind of really loving watercolor classes. I really enjoy that. And I was very fortunate at the beginning of this year to go on a voyage to Antarctica, as you said, with the women in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, medicine, maths. There was 100 of us from around the world who'd never met before. We met up in Ushuaia at the very southern tip of Argentina, and went across the Drake Passage on a 100-person expedition ship and toured around the Antarctic Peninsula with the idea of, it was kind of like a leadership, sustainability, climate change action kind of program. And that was extraordinary and just beyond words, the experience. So just try and do cool stuff. And for my 50th this year, me and my husband will have a party later in the year. He's also turning 50. And I was like, you know what I really want to do? I just want like having chats with friends. I love just having a glass of wine and catch up with an old friend. So we're buying a round the world ticket, and we're kind of doing this little round the world trip to see friends around the world that we haven't seen in a while. And our 50th celebrations are going to be conversations and glasses of wine and laughs and talks about their kids and their lives. And none of this is new under the sun stuff for brain health and well-being. It's just I'm just fortunate enough that I'm able to implement what I know into the work, from the work into my life. Yeah.
Yes, and to know the consequences of actually what you're doing. It's like you choose to do these things because you know at the back of your head that they're actually working for you.
And they feel good.
Yeah,
They feel good.
And
And we know what a healthy brain needs, and and it's not the ice bath, dudes. It's not the ice bath. It's not the supplements that are going to tweak the top 1%. It's the fundamentals. And actually that's why the kind of the bro biohacking world kind of drives me a bit nuts, because you do you, fellas, but most of the world hasn't got the basics right. Most of the world isn't doing the sleep, isn't doing the exercise, isn't doing the healthy diet, isn't doing the social connection, doesn't have the resources in place for good health care, doesn't have the resources in place for, the social determinants of health. And that's actually where we're going to see the biggest shifts, not tweaking that top little 1%. That the ice bath boys, as I like to call them, do. They can do their thing, but the messaging I want to get out is how to live life in a sort of a richer, funner way that deals with the basics, because that's where we're going to see a bigger shift in a population than the top 1% getting 0.5% better.
Absolutely. And let's shift a little the topics, because you're speaking with a designer here, with an architect. And I definitely want to know, how do you believe, or if you believe, that our environment can actually harness or enhance our well-being?
Yeah. Well, I think it's super interesting, because I always talk about like the brain. If we're thinking about the brain, like what is the information from our bottom-up body? Was the streams of information about our physiological sort of homeostatic status and self. And then there's the outside world, which makes its way in through our senses, so what we see and what we hear, and then if it's close enough, what it tastes like and smells like and feels like. And then, of course, that's all filtered through our psychological mind, our thoughts, our expectations, etc. And so if you think about a brain that's kind of moving through a world, it's very much like the sort of the senses that are coming in, and we know what we need. So if we kind of look at some basics of a healthy brain, how could like the built space or the environment in which we live influence that? So we know, and I always talk about sleep first, because if we sleep well, then everything else is much easier to build on a solid foundation of sleep than soggy, unslept minds. And so how does your sleeping space, just something as basic as that, facilitate a good night's sleep? So, you've got like the light, you've got the temperature, you've got the sound, what sort of sensory input are you receiving or cutting out or enabling to be able to create a sound, healthy night's sleep? So you've got something as simple as that in terms of the lived environment. I'm incredibly fortunate because the house I live in is quite elevated and it faces east. So, and me and my husband sleep with our curtains wide open because no one can see in. And so as soon as the sun comes up over the horizon, we see the sunrise, we see the morning sun. So that's just like a really simple architectural phenomenon that we happen to like. Although I did specifically and purposefully choose a house that had the kitchen, dining, living areas facing east, so we got the morning sun, just because to me that was how I kind of grew up. I just wanted that. So that's just I didn't make that decision because of neuroscience, but I mean it's pretty relevant to neuroscience. And then I think about other things like when I've lived in more kind of shared community spaces, like college halls of residence, when I was away at university. And I always remember I lived in this one particular, we always had shared communal spaces, we had shared dining spaces, we had shared living kind of bar, cafe type space. But then we all lived in these houses. And the house I lived in, there were 10 of us, and we all knew each other really well and we all got on really well. But a house a couple of doors down, like they didn't really kind of know each other. And I always had this strong belief that it was because the kitchen and the living space in our house was near the front door. So when you came in the front door, you had to walk past the shared living space before you went off to your bedrooms. Whereas the other house, the shared living space, you had to go down a hallway. So you didn't have that kind of bump and meet and greet where you naturally ran into people all the time. So you had to like go out and seek. And if there was no one else there, whereas if your architecture is designed to encourage people to meet and greet and interact first and foremost, then they will meet and greet and interact first and foremost. So I often think about, and I'm not a designer and I'm not an architect, but I know my husband's office building just got renovated a couple of years ago, and one of the main ways the architecture in that place was designed, because they wanted the bump and greet. They wanted people to be constantly running into each other naturally, because that facilitated collaboration. My son's high school is building a new senior kind of school, and they asked for input. And I don't know anything about architecture, but again, I said there needs to be space for quiet study, but there needs to be spaces where you're facilitating that natural meet and greet, where people aren't having to go and try and find where the other people are. They're already there, and they can opt out of that if they wish. So there are a couple of ways in which I think about how design and architecture can facilitate brain health. They're those two basics: sleep and social interaction.
Yes, and actually what we do, there's something called salutogenic design, which is, well, we talk about salute, which is health, genic from the Genesis. And there's like three main pillars for this. From the architecture point of view, which is cognition. We try to address cognition through design. We try to address also social interaction, social emotional interaction. And lastly, physiology. And with these three, architecture understands that actually it can generate or enhance well-being, enhance health.
Super interesting. Yeah. Absolutely. So did what I say make sense to architect?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, because you've mentioned the cognition of the silent and the noisy, also social-emotional, as you mentioned, like the going across someone, and I bet it actually encourages interaction. And the physiological with the sunlight and everything that you've mentioned with it, right? So it's like we take all these and we try to incorporate that in our design process to actually come up with something that is helping the human being, you know. And that's all I do with neuroarchitecture.
And finding a way for nature to kind of be part of that built space. And for me, that's very easy because, as I said, I'm sitting here and I'm looking out over green. I can see the water, I can see the sky. I've got green space, I've got blue space, I've got light coming in. When I was in Antarctica and when we were coming back, because people lived all around the world, and one of the conversations of the thousands that we had was, what do you want to do more of having left the ship and going back to your homes? And lots and lots of people said they wanted more nature in their lives. I actually wanted more people, because then I jokingly said I sometimes feel like nature is impinging on my house because I always leave the doors open and all the birds, there's a lot of birds in Australia, and the birds are always coming inside, and sometimes I can come in and there's 4 birds in the kitchen sink because I haven't done the dishes and they're all and the dog watches the birds flying over his head because he just thinks they also live in the house. So I want to keep I like to have nature in my house. I want people, but I think living where I do and having nature like literally so accessible, I couldn't imagine living in a way where it wasn't there. And I just naively, where I'd never thought about the fact that lots of people don't have nature, don't access the natural world all of the time. I can't imagine living that way. That just doesn't, I can't imagine what that's like. So I think that's a massively important part of what I understand and newer ways of thinking about, say, urban design, having blue spaces and green spaces and white spaces or horizons, you know, places where awe can kind of come in a little bit.
Yes. Also, like, as this salutogenic design that I mentioned, there's also biophilic design, which is huge. And there's a huge misunderstanding because people think that biophilic design is just adding a plant in a corner. Yeah. It's just like the how do you call them? The cold washer, the cold pluggers.
The cold water boys. The ice bath
cold
boys.
Water boys.
Ice bath boys.
The ice bath boys.
Yeah.
Well, there's the plant in the corner designers.
Yeah. And
then they call it biophilic design, you know. Biophilic design is when you incorporate nature in your space. It is a pillar of new design. You cannot design a space where you try to achieve or enhance well-being if you don't have nature in it. And
we are nature. We're not computerized robots. So
absolutely.
100%.
And and I'm not speaking only about plants. I'm speaking about textures, smells.
Yeah. Yeah.
sounds,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Okay. I want to go a little bit back to when we were talking about women and their well-being and all this, because it seems that women, from my point of view, and then you correct me if I'm wrong, seem to have like a heightened awareness of mental well-being and the importance of it when you compare it to men. And I wanted to know, since you've, let's say, studied women this much, because you've
Mm.
written two entire books about them,
Mm.
why do you think this is? And how can we actually harness awareness to create environments that truly support women?
I think there's mental health awareness, as in like kind of the public health campaigns teaching people about anxiety and depression and mental well-being. That's one, and I'm not sure if that's the question, or whether it's more about like rates of diagnoses and the sort of the sufferings, how many people actually have anxiety or depression. So just to address the first, I think the awareness in a public health sense depends where you live in the world. And my teenage sons actually say that they're always talking about mental health at school. Like, it'll be so good to have a week when we don't have Wellbeing Wednesday to talk about mental health. Like, kids in Australia have been flogged with this so much that they're just like, we don't want to hear about it anymore. They know about it. So they're very aware. I think for a long time, the people weren't aware, and perhaps women were more, because it was a health well-being. Women care about the health of their families and are more focused in on that. Many men are too, but perhaps in other parts of the world, and I can only speak from the Australian perspective and what my boys and husband tell me, for a long time that was always almost like not women's work, but mums are often in charge of the health of the family. So perhaps that awareness sort of started there. I will say that there's some really interesting research that's being done and some questions asked about is the fact that we have had so much mental health awareness increased the rate of diagnosis, whereby pretty natural emotional experiences, which may not necessarily always be positive at any point in your life, have become pathologized and tagged as a mental health problem. And there's some really interesting research being done in that space, because it's very, very hard to tease out cause and effect and a real diagnosis from a subclinical versus a natural, normal emotional response to something. So I think that whole space is really interesting and is evolving. And it perhaps depends where you are in the world, what the kind of awareness around that is. In terms of what we do understand about like the kind of the rates of diagnosis, or who's more likely or less likely to have anxiety or depression, and there's lots and lots of other mental illnesses, but they're by far and away the most common. If we look at childhood up to puberty, boys and girls would be formally diagnosed with anxiety and depression at pretty similar rates. And like, you don't really want a depressed 10-year-old, but like there might be some anxious 10-year-olds. Once you hit puberty, that sort of slowly starts to shift slightly. Globally, those rates have kind of started to accelerate in the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years. And again, sex differences aside and those rates of diagnosis, we don't know what's contributing to that, and there's probably multiple things. Some people want to say it's all of the social media, it's only the iPhones, or it's all about the cost of living crisis, or it's to do with global political instability, and they kind of want to, or it's diet, or it's whatever. People want to like kind of say it's one thing. It's always going to have to be like kind of a combination and a culmination of all of these things. When we look at like what happens from puberty onwards, then we do see, when we look as carefully as we can at particularly longitudinal studies where we're looking at large populations of people, and data isn't falling in the cracks, and we aren't relying on people presenting to a doctor saying, I'm depressed or I'm anxious, can you help me? Because that's not necessarily capturing everyone in a population. So if we look at like a longitudinal study, then we would see once you hit puberty, girls and women are more likely, in a rate of say maybe 2 3 to 2 or maybe 4 to 3. Kind of depends which population you look at. Girls and women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression than men. And so that changes at puberty, which is a bit of an indicator, one, that it could be something to do with biological sex and pubertal hormones. But it's really interesting because we also have to look at the social context and how your experience of going through puberty as a girl versus a boy is going to be different. And there's this really great study it's this kind of a series of studies looking at the emergence of anxiety and depression at puberty in girls and boys. And it's super interesting because if you have a girl who goes through puberty earlier than her friendship group, so maybe she gets her period at say 10, which is young, but it's normal. It's not like she's 5, she's 10, so early than most of her friends. There might be 1 or 2 other girls in her year. She's going to be far more vulnerable to go on to develop depression, either going through puberty or later, than a girl who goes through puberty about the same age as her friendship group or a bit later than her friendship group. So all of those girls are experiencing pubertal hormones for the first time, but it's the girl who's younger than her friendship group who's more vulnerable, which is interesting. If we look at boys who go through puberty earlier than their friendship group, what happens to a boy when he goes through puberty? He gets tall and big and hairy. He kind of almost becomes a bit more alpha in the group, so to speak. And he doesn't necessarily become more vulnerable to anxiety or depression. He takes a few more risks because testosterone is associated with risk-taking. But the boy who's far more vulnerable is the one who goes through much later than his friendship group. So you've got boys and girls here experiencing pubertal hormones for the first time and going through puberty at their particular trajectory and pace. But actually the stronger predictor is the social circumstance or social context in which that happens. So if the girls' rate is rising higher than the boys, can we say it's only biology, or does it have to be some kind of complex mix of a girl thinking about the changes in her body and is she emotionally ready and how does she feel about herself compared to other people and how are other people reacting and responding to her differently? So that automatically is different for boys than it is girls, which may kind of increase the risk slightly. We've got a whole host then of other biological and social and psychological factors which can contribute to that. And we see this kind of then throughout the lifespan. That said, we know that boys and men have far higher rates of undiagnosed depression and anxiety because there's often a culture of not reaching out for help. And we have much higher rates of suicide in boys and men. Maybe girls attempt suicide but aren't necessarily successful. So it's a really kind of complex conversation to have. And I think with any of these sort of topics, we need to be super thoughtful about what the many contributing factors can be and not just kind of pick one of them. Because the trend in the last year or so has been it's all about mobile phones and social media. And that's what makes them all depressed. But actually it's the girls who are kind of on the Instagram type social media who are probably more vulnerable, particularly around the ages of sort of 13 and 14. The boys aren't as vulnerable at that age because they're more likely to be gaming, and that doesn't seem to have that same depressive effect. I mean, it's a bit more like, they're kind of socially connecting and I've seen what they do versus the girls. So we try to oversimplify. And so I think at any, we've got to look at life stages and ages, and then we can look at, obviously, when you've gone through your first pregnancy and then you have your first baby, that's a really high risk time for postnatal depression. You can get postnatal depression in men, and fathers can get depressed. Obviously, it's not to do with the hormones, it's to do with this enormous life shift and shift of an identity. And women, what is causing postnatal depression is a culmination of you've just come out of a pregnancy, off the hormones of pregnancy, you've gone through labour and delivery, however that baby came out, your brain has changed neurologically during the course of a pregnancy to focus you in on reading your baby's cues. You don't know who this new baby is. You're incredibly sleep deprived. You're in a very physiologically vulnerable state. Your nervous system is heightened, so you have a lot of intrusive thoughts about harm happening to your baby, which happens to everyone. If you're socially isolated, you're probably more lonely and confused than you've ever been in life. So, then there's a massive sex difference there, but it's not simply because of biology or hormones. So we need to kind of think about things like anxiety and depression and this is what scientists like to do. We like to break it down into its component parts and then try and look at it from every angle and try and assess what all of the different variables are. And that's what I try and do, is just try and get people to sort of step back and take a bit of a bigger picture perspective. Because if we hone in on only one solution, we then ignore everything else that's a contributor.
Absolutely. So it's definitely not that women have a heightened awareness of mental well-being. It's just that they talk about it more.
So, in some cultures and some parts of the world, like I say, my teenage sons say they have to talk about it every week and they're so sick of talking about it. I think that women in relationships with women and men in relationships with men, conversations are different. But of course, there's masses of variation, and women are kind of more social and do talk more about people and feelings and who they are and what's going on. That can be really great, but it can also mean you kind of end up co-ruminating. Men might be a bit more action-taking-y and, whatnot. But, I mean, they're very broad generalizations. I think women are more vulnerable for many reasons, but that's not to say men aren't. And that's why we have higher suicide rates in men than women. I think many men are aware. It perhaps depends on who that man is, how he was raised, and how he kind of makes his way through the world, how self-aware he is and how willing he is to reach out for help if he needs it. And I'm starting to see more and more men, boys and men, be getting better at that, or getting sick of it like my sons. But they're pretty. Their mental health thus far has been reasonably robust.
Yeah, I mean, there's parts and parts of the world,
100%. And every different parts of the world, there's such a massive global cultural lens to put on this. And that's what's totally fascinating. Like, we see things like PMS, like women saying they feel moody and cranky in the days before their period, varies massively globally. So, it's like 10, I know this data off the top of my head, there's about 10% of women in France say they have PMS, around 30% of women in Spain, but around 90% of women in Iran. So is it 10% or 90% or 30%? Like, what is it? If it's purely biological, why is it varying by between 10 and almost everyone or hardly anyone in different parts of the world? Is because I think we fail to understand how powerful that social cultural lens is as a determinant of health outcome and a perception of self and the meaning you make of what's happening in your body in a context.
Yes. And then there's dysphoric
MDD.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, the sort of more serious type of PMS, which we know kind of is can be more clinically sort of described and defined, and that sort of falls out at about 10%. So and I joke when I say, because this again is a massive cultural stereotype, is that in the study looking at different rates in different countries of the world, PMDD falls out around same as women in France. So the women in France were saying they have PMS. They've got other reasons in which they can display their anger or whatever. They don't need an excuse because they're French. They can say what they like. It's interesting because if you jump the border from France to Spain, it jumps from 10 to 30%. That's clearly must reflect a cultural difference. You go into the Middle East, it's 90. Is that because those women are trying to... It's the feminist kind of the feminist literature academic take on this is that PMS is women's self-silence for 3 weeks of the month, and then 1 week of the month they can actually say how they truly feel and say that it's PMS, and then they can get away with it. So perhaps that's where there's kind of a cultural thing going on there.
Maybe that's
it. So it's super interesting when you look at when you think about how the brain creates an experience, creates a thought, creates an emotion, is aware of something. like there's our biology, but then there's this work, this context in which we live, in which we've marinated in since we're born, which has shaped and sculpted and wired our brain, the expectations we have, the cultural norms, all of these are inputs into the brain to create a perception or an awareness of an experience, including something like PMS.
Yes, and actually I haven't thought about PMS being something that can be influenced by culture, by you having to shut your mouth for three weeks and then having to being able to say something because you're PMSing, and then that's
100%,
accepted.
100%, absolutely. And some studies have been done. Really, the scientists are trying to get cleverer and better at doing this sort of science. And so there's studies around the world which are looking at things like how much do menstrual hormone fluctuations influence mood and emotions. And one study was looked at men and women, like kind of every day of the month, and studied them in quite a lot of detail, and found that male and female emotions waxed and waned and fluctuated equally. The woman didn't show any greater fluctuations, and some of the men showed much greater emotional fluctuations than any of the women did. And we know that men can be terribly emotional, because that's why they go to war with each other, versus women. And also the woman's emotional state doesn't always automatically reflect their hormonal status across the course of the month. We've been led to believe that we all ride this kind of monthly emotional roller coaster guided by or driven by hormones. But studies that have looked at women's emotions like every day of the month, and given them as positive emotions, neutral emotions, and negative emotions to choose from, again, don't find that only about 10% of women show clear emotions that track alongside their hormone status. When you tell a woman you are studying PMS, that kind of percentage goes up. But if they're blinded to what is being studied, it's only about, again, it comes out at about 10%. Women's emotions are far more likely to be influenced by how sort of their overall well-being or feelings of stress or health, like literally physical health and well-being, and also how more so by how socially supported they feel. So do they feel understood and supported and loved and cared for? If they don't, or they're in a disrupted relationship, then they're far more likely to report PMS symptoms or report negative mood. So again, we have this idea where women's negative mood is always influenced by hormones and men's isn't. As I said, men's is all about strength, power, and performance. Women's is always brains are broken. And we don't see that play out when we look at these careful studies. And perhaps that's why there's this massive cultural influence as well, because the stories you've been brought up with and the meaning you make is going to influence an outcome that you have. That's why we can treat mental health with cognitive behavioral therapy and with psychology, because we can change how you think and change an emotional outcome.
Yeah, that's what.
Now, of course, that's not to say the 10%. There is this 10% of women who are hormone sensitive and do show these shifts, but most women don't. But a lot of them think that they do, which is a shame, because you're removing a lot of agency then, because you can't do anything about your hormones. I mean, you kind of can, but take the pill or get pregnant and have lots of hormones, or go on hormone therapy, or have your ovaries out and have none, whatever. There's lots of ways in which hormone levels can be manipulated, but I feel like we think that they're responsible for every negative thing that happens. And that's certainly not what the careful science shows.
Maybe this can be shifted. Maybe if we talk about neuroplasticity here, it can be shifted if we work on it and if we put our minds to just understand that maybe it's not hormones.
Yeah. I mean, it might be something else. Maybe it is, but maybe it's something else. And that's essentially all of our brain, there's this concept in neuroscience, the brain is a prediction machine or a learning machine. It just learns what works and then predicts what to do next based on the context you're in. And so, you may feel a certain way about a person or a place or an experience because your brain learned that really mattered. And so next time you're in that situation or with that person, your brain predicts how you should behave. So cognitive behavioral therapy might be a way of sort of challenging that automatic outcome, or training you to think about that person or place or situation in a new way. And perhaps if you rehearse that scenario of many times over, then that's the brain learning a different response. And that's kind of what plasticity is, because the brain is plastic, and it's more or less plastic at different stages of life, and different networks are more or less plastic. When you're a baby and a young child, everything changes your brain. I said my PhD work was looking at development of the visual system. And so you need visual input. You need to be able to see for your visual brain to wire up appropriately. You don't, once you're kind of in childhood and adulthood, your visual system is up and running. It doesn't need to constantly be learning how to see. But other parts of your brain, perhaps networks involved with emotion regulation, they're constantly plastic and can constantly be changing. Your language centers are interesting because we know they're most plastic in infancy and early childhood. And that's why we've all got like kind of the language that our mothers and fathers spoke to us, our first language. Some people are lucky enough to learn 2 or even 3 languages when their language centers are super plastic. But that plasticity does dial down. It gets a whole lot harder to learn a new language by default when you're 18 or when you're 35. You've got to like really learn it like you would learn any kind of new skill. It's a whole lot harder. So some brain networks open and very plastic and then close down very, very early in development. Others kind of open and close a little more gently, and others sort of kind of malleable throughout the lifespan. And we know the brain stays malleable throughout the lifespan because it needs to be able to learn and remember. That's why you can remember what you did yesterday, and if you're reading a book, you can remember what happened last time you picked the book up. And you watch a TV show, you remember what happened in the last episode, because your brain is plastic and it can learn, and it has changed to retain that memory.
Absolutely. Okay, and I know that your son is kind of tired of this topic, and I know that they talk about it in Australia a lot.
Yeah.
But this is not the reality for a lot of other countries.
Yep, absolutely.
And actually, according to the Sapiens Lab's mental state of the world's report, mental health among the younger generations is declining. In fact, challenges with focus, emotional regulation, and social interaction are increasing in younger adults. And this has not improved since the pandemic.
Yeah.
So my question to you as a neuroscientist is, how do you believe that the pandemic has reshaped the way our brains process stress and emotions? And also, do you think that there are ways that we can actually address or help address this through intentional design?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure about the second part of the question. I think the first part, it was fundamentally mattered at which sort of life stage and age you were, which stage of development. So new babies, babies are raised on farms and, remote places and without interaction apart from anyone except for their parents everywhere in the world all of the time. So I'm not entirely sure it mattered if a 6-month-old baby wasn't interacting with anyone outside their immediate family. That's not like a fundamentally crucial stage of social brain development. You really just need to be interacting with your immediate caregivers. That's very, very different from, say, a 13, 14, 15-year-old where they're going through puberty, and most of the changes that take place in the adolescent brain are around social cognition. So interacting with other people, reading and interacting with other people's faces and emotions and perceiving other people socially, making meaning, using social cognition to kind of make meaning of other people, and then behaving and interacting with other people. So if we think about the social brain, it's pulling in information, making meaning of that, and then behaving and interacting with other people. And we go through this very sensitive phase of social brain development in childhood, late childhood and early adolescence, where because the social brain is very plastic, and so it needs social interactions to guide its development. It needs a lot, and it's really great because kids going through puberty and adolescence usually at high school, and it's a very intense social time. And suddenly they spent 2 years being told, if you see another person, you might kill them. Like, that's an extreme version of what they were literally being told. Do not socialize. If you socialize, we will arrest you. If you socialize, you're risking your life, you're risking other people's life. It was incredibly confusing messaging. I think different kids at different phases, adults set them aside, but if we look at that kind of 0 to sort of 18, it depended on where they were in terms of their neurological development, how much impact that had or not. And also it depended on the context. So here in where I live on the beaches, I could take my boys down to the beach because I was legally allowed to go that far. They had to go and meet their mates on their surfboards out in the waves, and no one was going to be arresting them out there for socializing. So I tried to create a way in which they could have their social interactions, which was so fundamentally important to them at that life stage, in a way that was legal. Other kids just didn't have those opportunities, or parents that were able to do that, or lived somewhere where that was kind of possible. I do see a little bit of, and there's different cohorts of kids, and this is just speaking personally in terms of knowing heaps of people with children, kids who were in those first couple of years of primary school where the fundamental requirements is that's when they're first learning to read and first learning to write and letter recognition, and there's kind of really early kind of emotional regulation skills when you're away from home and you're in the classroom, and they missed out on kind of 2 years of that, and so they're kind of struggling with that. Kids who are at the later years of high school, when it's really about relationships and it's about becoming an adult and venturing out into the world and being independent, they couldn't do that either. So we've seen a bit of a shift there. So, and other kids were perhaps in betweeny ages, 8 to 11, 12, they were kind of okay. They could do their little online school. It was probably less important for them, but still not great. So there's lots of skills that you learn when you're interacting with other people. There's the cognitive lessons you're learning from teachers. There's the social interactions you're learning with other people. There's the skills of emotional regulation that you're learning. And there was kind of, depending where you lived, 2 years where sometimes you were told even if that's what you're naturally drawn to do as a human, you were told that it was wrong. And that's a really conflicting message to give. And I think that people now recognize the damage, the unintentional damage that was done, although many people knew it was happening when it was happening, the unintentional damage that's had on generations of kids. How can we recover from that? I think if we understand that happened, that's the first step. But it's difficult because sometimes these happen at really critical life points that you can't kind of go back and repeat again. I think any change or recovery has to start with an awareness of what happened, and then to take the best, and I'm not sure what they are, but to take the best evidence-based practices to help those kids recover. Adults, that's another whole kettle of it, because like an adult, right, you've also got to take a bit of responsibility for yourself, but you also have to know that there was perhaps a problem. Lots of people talk about this social battery. They became they run out of social battery because they had a couple of years of not being, being out of practice. The thing that I see is that people now opt out. It's like there was always this massive social expectation that you showed up and you went to events and you went to places, and suddenly you had 2 years where you could opt out and you didn't have to go. And sometimes that's easier, and people's social battery runs out, so they're not as easy, they don't commit as much anymore. And I think that's to everyone's detriment. So that's perhaps an awareness thing that we need to deal with as well. But I think the developmental stuff is far more damaging. Yeah. Can we get around it? I don't know about how clever design can navigate that.
Okay, I understand. And if I was to ask you, and this is, I would say, the last question about design, okay? What role do you see neuroscience, which is your expertise, if you see any, playing in the future of architecture and interior design, in the future of the design of our environments?
Well, I'm not sure it's about the science itself. I think it's about collaborations between people working in these disciplines in really thoughtful, smart, evidence-based ways where there's a problem and it's I'm not sure how much architecture can help neuroscience, but maybe neuroscience can help architecture. But that requires people coming together, identifying problems, and being super thoughtful and careful about how one discipline can inform another. We can't just add in a neuro prefix. We can't just say a brain word and think that that's the use of neuroscience in another discipline. This is what I do with neuroscience and coaching is, what is the kind of problem? I've actually got this particular process that I even teach where I try and talk people through kind of take people through this sort of 7-step process. I kind of say, like, what is this particular problem that you're trying to solve in this other discipline, whether it be coaching or whether it be architecture? How can I help my clients, blah, or how, what is the problem that you see? And then, how can you then define the specific goal? Like, how do you perceive is going to be an outcome to that problem? Like, what might a solution to the outcome be? And then how can we ground that in neuroscience? So is there actually and there might not be, like, neuroscience isn't a magic wand that can suddenly solve every problem on the planet and every discipline in the planet. But is there something and maybe it's not neuroscience, maybe it's psychology, maybe it's, a different discipline altogether. Obviously engineering and architecture are very closely related, and maths and, all that kind of stuff. But does understanding how the brain works build a building? I don't know. Like, you've got to be really thoughtful and clear and specific about what is this particular problem and what can neuroscience do to help solve that problem in an evidence-based, science-first way. Not just using words, not just saying things. And then how can you kind of make it practical? Like, how can you integrate that in? And in coaching, I say that could be anything from a metaphor to a mnemonic to a training course to a PowerPoint presentation to a PDF to a exercise program. It could be one word or it could be a whole kind of suite of programs. And then you've got to test it, and you'd know that because, the space you work in, you build a prototype and you test it and you see what works and you see what doesn't, and you gather feedback and you refine and you adapt and you iterate, because you can't just assume that this idea you have is going to work or resonate or solve that problem. And then once you've kind of built that, then you can kind of start deploying it. So, that's just kind of like a process that you would use in any sort of design process, I guess, or designing an experiment process. But I think people kind of miss those really careful, thoughtful steps when they're looking at adding a neuro prefix or adding a neuroscience into a different discipline. They just think it's going to magically, that there's going to be a part of the brain that recognizes, they just think, if we know which part of the brain does that, we're going to solve the problem. That's not how it works.
Yes.
So, maybe even use design principles to think about how to use neuroscience in design. I don't know. That's how I kind of see the field going, and what I get frustrated because people just say, they talk about the lizard brain, or they talk about fight or flight, or they talk about amygdala hijack, or they talk about dopamine, or they talk about serotonin in the gut. And none of that's meaning. All of that is utterly meaningless. They're just words that sound neuroscience-y, that aren't doing anything. They're just a word that you've said. Why have you even said that word? What does that mean? What's your intention? How's that
What's
informed?
the biggest myth about brain?
I think that this idea about the lizard brain, the triune brain, the reptilian brain, that we've all got this kind of really sort of evolutionary basic lizard brain deep within us, which drives our emotions, and it's just there waiting to keep you alive. First of all, when this idea was first proposed back in the 1960s, and we don't usually hang on to ideas from the 60s and, neuroscience, 70 years later, the reptilian brain, and if you look up reptilian brain or lizard brain and do a Google image search, I guarantee every single picture will point to a different part of the brain. I have this diagram where I show that because it's not a real thing. And initially, the chap that first described it, Paul McLean, he was describing kind of like the brainstem, the part of the brain that's involved with things like your heart rate and your breathing and those super automated responses which kind of keep your body alive. And then on top of that, he called the next part of the brain, like he called it the mammalian brain or the limbic brain, which is involved with things like emotional processing and kind of making meaning and salience and what's important. Not higher order cognitive things like doing maths or planning, but more like the next kind of level above that, sort of in between the reptilian and above that. But everyone who uses the word lizard brain is actually using it to describe what he called the mammalian brain. So, but the idea is then completely misusing his idea, one. Two, it's not even how the brain develops or how the brain evolved. And three, it removes any agency whatsoever from anyone to then be able to have a different response because they've been taught that that emotional response has been hardwired into you since you were a lizard. And humans didn't evolve from lizards. This idea has been, it removes any agency of being able to learn a new emotion or having a different emotional response to the same particular situation. Our current theory about emotions are the kind of the same as thoughts or beliefs or memories. We construct them based on what's happening in our body and the context we're in and the words we use to describe them. And when we've experienced them a few times, then we kind of give them a name, whether it be happy, sad, angry, nervous, whatever. They're not like these fundamental lizard responses whereby every single person on the planet will respond in the same way. Lizards everywhere in the world act pretty similarly, depending on the type of size of lizard. Humans everywhere in the world do not all react in identical ways to identical situations because we don't have lizard brains in us. Lizard brains are in lizards.
And that's it.
So that's one idea which drives me crazy, and it shows poor neuroscience literacy. And that's okay. Not everyone has literacy, let alone science literacy, let alone neuroscience literacy. But when people are using that in part of their work, then that shows that they're not up to date with neuroscience. Even the word, and some other things that aren't necessarily famous neuromyths, but things I try and teach which are related to this. So even the word stress, people tell me, talk about stress in the brain. And I go, well, a neuroscientist would take that word and try and come up with far better, more specific definitions. So we've got an external event, could be a threat, it could be a challenge, it could be an opportunity, or a threat or a challenge or opportunity within your own mind could then activate your stress response systems, of which there are numerous in your body. And you could respond an identical way to a threat as someone else, and someone else could perceive that as an opportunity or like a dog, say. Some people are petrified of dogs. Some people love dogs. Some people see dogs as a challenge. They need to be trained or used to muster sheep. Other people think they're going to bite them. So you've got this specific perception, and someone who's really happy and excited to see a dog is going to have a very different systematic sort of nervous system response than someone who's scared of a dog. But you could have two people who have exactly the same nervous system response. Say someone's about to run a race and someone's about to fire someone in their job. And both of those people, heart rates are up and their stress response systems are going. But one of them's about to win a gold medal and the other one's about to ruin someone's life. So, we've got different stress response systems. And then we've got the kind of the words that we use to describe the stress responses that we're having in relationship to the threats, challenges, and opportunities. So even you can see there, we have to break it down into all of these component parts into this sort of stress ecosystem before we can even start digging into what the neuroscience means about that. So if we're using these basic terms like amygdala hijack or lizard brain or fight or flight, we automatically lose the ability to talk about how the brain and nervous system actually work and process information.
Yeah, it's so broad. It cannot be pinpointed.
No, 100% it can't. So I try and teach this in all of my courses and in talks and things like that. It's a bit harder to do over a podcast, but...
Yeah. Okay, so if you could broadcast one message about mental health, about brain health to the world, what would it be?
Sleep. Sleep is the foundation, the bedrock of everything. If you're struggling with mental health, your sleep is probably going to be disrupted. And if your sleep is disrupted, it's going to make mental health worse mental health. So if you can get sleep and focus in on sleep and try and get that sorted, and there's lots and lots of different ways to do that. Unfortunately, if you have a lot of intrusive thoughts and you have embedded mood disorders, it is that much harder. But I think if you can build everything on a foundation of good, solid sleep, everything else is easier. So all of the boring basics that you've heard about sleep hygiene that not everyone's really interested in doing because I think it sounds dull, it's not as exciting as what the ice bath boys would tell you to do. But, the cool room, the cool, quiet, dark room, your morning sunlight, the exercise, don't drink caffeine or alcohol at night, don't go on your mobile phone and get yourself all keyed up before you're going to sleep. All of those basics. And if you can get that foundation in place, then everything else will be that much easier to do.
What about red light?
I think light is really important, but the sun rises and the sun sets everywhere on the planet, obviously at different times of the day and different times of the year, depending on how close or far away you live from the equator. But, we kind of evolved with a 24-hour circadian clock with inside every one of our cells, and that has been entrained by the spinning of the earth on its axis, which looks to us like the sun going up and down. So, we've already kind of got the light dark built in. It's just we now live in these artificial environments where we kind of think that we somehow need to be artificial about it. So, go away, camp in the bush for 2 weeks and try and get yourself back on track that way. That might be a very privileged solution for some. But yeah, I think, if you need to be relying on different kind of coloured lights instead of the natural environment first, then that, if you've done everything else, then that's kind of down the track. Like you've got to do the basics first. And this is the problem, is all of the peak performance stuff never deal well, maybe it assumes you've got the basics right. It's not teaching you the basics from the beginning.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah, it's been a pleasure and a real honor to have you here with us.
Oh, no, you're very welcome. Thank you so much.
Where can people learn more about your work? Where can they go?
Just go to my website. That's like the portal into everything else, to courses, books, social media, talks, etc. So that's Dr. Sarah McKay, MCKAY.com.
Awesome.
Thanks for the opportunity.